Having said all that, I want to welcome you all to today's Brown Bag Talk, Indigenizing the Writing Center with Georganne Nordstrom, Kalilinoe Detwiler, and Kayla Watabu. This is co-sponsored by Hamilton Library, the Spark M. Matsunaga Institute for Peace and Conflict Resolution, Hui Aina Pilipili, Native Hawaiian Initiative, the Hawaii Nui Akea School of Hawaiian Knowledge, the School of Communications, and the Department of Ethnic Studies, Political Science, and Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. I think you'll find out quite a bit about all three of our speakers today. I'll just provide a brief bio because this, after all, is the Center for Biographical Research. Dr. Georganne Nordstrom is an associate professor of composition and rhetoric and associate chair of the English department at the University of Hawaiʻi at Manoa, where she directed the University of Hawaiʻi at Mānoa Writing Center for 7 years. She currently serves as the vice president of the International Writing Center Association, and her recent book, A Practitioner's Inquiry into Collaboration, Research, Practice, and Pedagogy, was published by Routledge Press in 2021, and it draws from Kanaka Maoli concepts to foreground ethical approaches for conducting empirical work in writing centers. I think this might have something vaguely to do with the subject of our talk today. Kalilinoe Detwiler is a Kanaka-Weavy graduate assistant at the UHM Writing Center, where she serves as a writing consultant, center coordinator, and web PR coordinator. She proposed the project, A Decolonial Writing Center, Sustaining Ea, to familiarize consultants with Oiwi knowledge and resources that support student writing in Hawaii. I should also mention she was recently selected as one of the initial cohort for INAPO, Indigenous National Poets Retreat. 3 of the 16 awardees nationally are from Hawaii. Congratulations as well to Tina Tokovao from the Department of English and Ha'anisan Nicholas from American Studies. And congratulations as well, Illinois. That's a wonderful honor. And Kayla Watabu is a second-year master's student working with the UHM Writing Center as a writing consultant and research coordinator. Her current research is focused on reimagining and transforming the silences present in her family histories by engaging with cultural practices rooted in her Japanese, Chinese, and Kanaka-Oiwi heritage. We clearly have 3 remarkable speakers who bring a range of experience to what they're about to talk about, and I know I'm very much looking forward to hearing what they're going to share with us. So, aloha.
Mahalo, Craig, and mahalo everyone for coming today. I'm so excited that so many current and past Writing Center consultants are in the audience. Thank you for coming out and supporting us. Really grateful. We'd like to mahalo the Center for Biographical Research and Dr. Craig Howes, Dr. Cindy Franklin, Dr. John Zern, Zoe Sprout, who's been wonderful in corresponding and getting this set up and created the poster, and Paige Rasmussen for all your work behind the scenes. Thank you so much. I'm going to start today's talk, and I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes, and then I'm going to turn it over to Kayla and Kalilinoe, and I'm going to start by sharing screen. Give me just a sec. Okay, so the title of our talk today is Indigenizing the Writing Center. And when we began putting this talk together, I started with the 2 olelo no'iao that have been chosen to welcome people into our center. The first one I selected in collaboration with the staff that was part of the team then, and that was probably in about 2015. And the one on the right is the olelo no'iao chosen by the recent cohort of Writing Center consultants. And when I looked at these 2 posters, I felt that they really represented the movement we've made towards incorporating Indigenous, specifically Kanaka Maoli concepts and grounding into our Writing Center work. And I was struck by the way English is represented in the translations. In 2015, it has an equal weight, an equal font. And as we've moved forward into 2022, the English is it's subscripted compared to the olelo. And I think that that really represents our movement. Craig pretty much talked about everything that's on this slide as I was going to introduce myself, but I do want to say that this presentation not only draws from work in my book, A Writing Center Practitioners Inquiry into Collaboration, but also into two collaborative projects that were created and co-authored in our Writing Center by several of the consultants that are in the audience right now. The first one was an international presentation called Affirming Our Liminality in Writing on the Walls. And there was a follow-up published article in a peer-reviewed journal called Affirming Our Liminality in Writing on the Walls, How We Welcome in Our Writing Center. And the work that I'm going to be talking about today represents those efforts. My co-presenters, who I'm very proud to be presenting with, are Kalilinoe Detwiler and Kayla Watabu. They both play significant roles in Writing Center research, and they're both concluding their masters and headed to PhD programs in the fall. So happy and proud to be working with them. Thank you for presenting today. Okay, I'm going to start at the beginning of my tenure as the Writing Center Director in 2012. And quickly, I forgot in the thank yous, I'd like to acknowledge Dr. Todd Salmons and Aaron Ki'ilau, who are both here today and who are currently at the helm of the Writing Center and have been for the last 2 years and have kept this work going. And I thank you so much. So in 2012, when I started, I largely identified as a student-centered, place-based pedagogue. Those were the foundational theories that I thought of, that I drew from influencing my work. My research practices were largely guided by tenets promoted by teacher research, which would later be morphed into practitioner research, so that it better represented the different ways that people who performed service in academic institutions were represented in the scholarship. So what did this mean for me? It means that I understood meaning as socially constructed. I understood that whatever meaning I was trying to convey relied on me relying on my participants and the expertise they brought to any particular engagement. And this also acknowledges that all participants in an exchange bring expertise in certain areas, and that should not only be acknowledged, but celebrated. I also have always had a strong investment in collaboration, although the process of my being Writing Center Director really forced me to revisit the treatments of collaboration, and I'll get into that a little bit later. I was particularly guided by Cochran Smith and Susan Little's work, both teacher researchers, and this idea they have that the assumption that those who work in particular educational contexts and or work and live in particular social situations have significant knowledge about those situations. And for me, in my context in a writing center, this told me that my students, our students, have expertise and knowledge that not only could grow our work, but also had that it would make it better and more important and more impactful to the people that we wanted to work with and support. Teacher research also foregrounds the important role of research in validating not only practices enacted, but the work of those facilitating such work, whether through service or teaching. And this was foundational in articulating the very first line of our mission statement in the Writing Center, which is this is a pedagogical site that supports both teaching research, and service. I see research as fundamental in that work. And then I started working. And there was a reality on the ground that I had to quickly address. I could not sustain what I envisioned for our center and where I saw it growing by myself. My vision alone was also inadequate if I truly believe that the student consultants I work with have significant knowledge about our school, their fellow students, and the work we were trying to facilitate. I also knew that I didn't always get where students were coming from or what they needed. My position as a faculty member distanced me in some ways, and we needed that knowledge if we wanted our service to really be a support service. And number three, and I think that there's people in this audience that are going to understand this really well, I had very limited almost zero funding. So the challenge I had was how to incorporate student expertise and knowledge without exploiting them. How to make sure the benefits to them were reciprocal to the knowledge and work we were contributing, and the benefits to me as a tenure track faculty, which were significant. If I published, that aided me in receiving tenure. If our service was successful, I had a claim within the department, within my college, on the campus, all things that could aid me in getting promoted. But what about my students? I wanted to show a picture of our original space. It was very small. It was a classroom, but we were always concerned with welcome. We were always concerned with making our students feel welcome. And one of the very first ways we did this was we provided coffee and tea. And of course, we had no funding, so we relied on donations to support this. And this wound up being a very successful and kind of easy tact that we enacted. You can also see that very early on, we tried to bring in aesthetics that made the place welcoming. When I was a graduate student, my very first empirical study focused on the lack of representation of students from Hawaii in our writing center visitors. And I was very, very conscious that those are the students I wanted to foreground in this work. I wanted them to feel welcome in this space and knew that they were coming in for support and not, and that entering into the space was not an inferiority marker. As my research began to morph more into acknowledging and incorporating Indigenous, specifically Pacific Island ways of knowing and being, I looked to Linda Tuhiwai Smith. She became increasingly influential in my work, and I wanted to find ways to incorporate what she advocates for research into my practices. So Linda Tuhiwai Smith explains key elements for researchers in establishing reciprocal relationships with the participants in their communities. The interests and concerns of research participants should be heard and engaged. The research should benefit all parties, and the knowledge gained through this research should be disseminated to the community that helped shape it. Smith grounds the concepts of reciprocity and respect as intrinsic to an Indigenous worldview. I wanted to work with ways of incorporating this and adapting it as a practice. So I was looking for ways to use reciprocity as a guiding principle and extending it beyond the work conducted in the confines of the actual center to include a recognition how this place where our center resided in and the people it resides among enable us to achieve our work. Collaboration increasingly gained a foreground in my approaches, which meant realizing the articulations of collaboration in the scholarship and practices are limited and vague. As I was looking through scholarship, it became really apparent to me that the word collaboration was frequently dropped into discussions with no explanations of what made an interaction collaborative, what happened in the interaction that maintained that collaboration, or how the outcomes were the result of a collaboration. Usually the word collaboration is dropped in and it's expected to represent all of that with no really clear explication of how that's going on. And this was very prominent in composition and rhetoric scholarship, but also in other pedagogical areas I looked at. I wanted to focus equally on what benefits each group of participants in the project. So speaking back again to reciprocity, the administrators, the writers, the consultants, students in general. And I wanted to make sure that the benefits people were realizing were on par with each other. This work demanded listening and hearing. And those, of course, are traits that people like Linda Tuhiwai Smith have advocated largely. You have to listen to the community that you're working it with. Okay, well, I think I went. So as I began to think more about issues of collaboration, I became very influenced by ideas of laulima and kuleana. Interestingly, when I went to the Hawaiian dictionary, Pukui and Albert, there was no translation for the word collaboration, but there is a translation for the word cooperation. And I became very interested in that disjuncture about what was going on between cooperation and collaboration. And I was drawn to Olelo no Iao as a guide for behavior. And that too pointed to cooperation, but not necessarily collaboration. And this one particular ololonoʻiao that guided particularly the chapter on collaboration in my book talks about how we all have to work together, bale and paddle, good and bad, exercising strength and taking care of the feasibility of the va'a to make sure the shore is reached. But if you know anything about paddling, everybody doesn't assume the same role. Different positions in the va'a have different roles, and the performance is equitable, but it's not equal. And this idea really spoke to how we could celebrate the consultants' expertise, their individual skills that they bring, but not expecting the same thing from everybody, but benefiting from the cooperative effort that we all put into this endeavor of growing our center. For kuleana, I was looking at the work of Ku'aloha Ho'omanawanui, Noelani Goodyear Ka'opua, Mehana Vaughn. And one of the things, besides the emphasis that with kuleana comes responsibility, obligation, and privilege, but the idea that when you're doing work that claims a kind of kuleana, you have to look at the community involved and the implications of your actions outside of the immediate context within which they're invoked. So it demanded that we take a look at where we are and how the work we're doing represents and pays homage to and honor to where we exist. So implicit in the projects of the scholars of whom I was reading was an assumption of effect beyond any immediate context, thus attending to the possible ramifications of an act as essential. Kuleana then, when fully realized, goes beyond an individual's actions. It is a dynamic interplay that attends to the concerns and interests of a community. And we were beginning to realize that our community was not only the Writing Center, not only the English department, not only the UH Mānoa campus, but Honolulu, Oahu, and Hawaii. And we wanted to take into account how our work was acknowledging that. When you engage a resource, whether tangible artifact or a concept or approach, you must go beyond citing and acknowledging to attending to the concerns of that community that has produced that resource. Okay, so I began crafting questions that I could literally answer. I'm an empiricist, so that I could literally answer to keep checks on this work. So with research, I articulated 2 research questions that were later incorporated into an empirical study. Was a collaborative environment achieved in the Writing Center as evidenced by consultants indicating they experienced an investment in the work environment, agency and interactions in the work of the center, and learning acquisition of skills? And second, did employing a collaborative approach to our work have a positive impact on consultants' professionalization? And I did conduct empirical work on this, and the findings were quite interesting. And I'll talk about them a little bit later if we have time. But to direct practice, I came up with a different set of questions. What sources of knowledge do the consultants bring? How am I benefiting from the work the consultants do? How are the consultants benefiting? What is the benefit to the center and those who use it? And are the benefits fairly equitable, or are they skewed to favor one party? These were guiding principles and remain guiding principles for me in much of my work. Okay, some of the things we did to engender these ideas that we were exploring as a team. I created leadership roles immediately. Part of this was because, and some people in the audience are going to remember this, we just had too much work, and the center was growing faster than what we could keep up with. So I needed people to assume roles in leadership. So we created an assistant director position, a center coordinator position, workshop coordinator, PR coordinator, and website coordinator. But these roles were also fashioned so that they could be accomplished within the time that the consultants were scheduled to work in the center, and as things that they could cite on their CVs and going into their professional pursuits. Key to this is providing a space for people to lead in these roles. It also means recognizing that not everyone wants them. And when we're talking about providing space, it means letting go And I am known as someone who's fairly tenacious and has a little bit of control issues sometimes. It means when someone took these roles, I had to let them do it their way. The buck stopped with me. I protected them to the extent I could when anything came up, and that rarely ever happened. But when you engender someone with a responsibility, you need to let them grow that job the way they see it. And the richness that grew out of this, that went beyond my wildest dreams, is hard to capture, because the students I worked with had ideas I had never even begun to imagine. This also demands regularly checking in on how the work is being experienced by not only the writers visiting the center, but also the consultants. We were the first center I know of in the United States when we articulated student learning outcomes. They weren't just for writers who visit the center, but we had student learning outcomes for the consultants who work in the center. Sharing decision-making, which means trusting, and giving room to take the lead and do things differently. This was one of the most meaningful learning processes I've ever gone through in working with my students, our students. So this is the very first moment of one of our first nationally collaborative events, where what you see here is a picture of the current center when it was open pre-pandemic. And those are the Writing Center consultants up against the wall, and everybody is drawing their vision for our center, what it's supposed to physically look like and what it's supposed to achieve in our daily activities. We adapted this activity for a national presentation that was extremely successful and well attended. It then morphed into, and there's several people who participated in this project here today, so that, thank you. And this morphed into a published article co-written by me and 8 other writing consultants that was published in the peer review in 2019. We began really being invested in finding ways to invite and make sure that people with different positionalities and identities felt welcome and could relate to the center. Some of that involved pedagogical. You see under the computer screen, there's Legos, Post-its, colored pens. Not everybody learns the same way. People have kinetic, tactile learning styles, and these are meant to address that. We also painted our walls with whiteboard paint, and we would actively use those whiteboards in sessions. The whiteboard that you see in the lower part of the screen with all the writing, that's on our socialization side of the center. And every week it featured a question that people would answer. And this began what our tutors were later going to call a Burkean parlor, means for people to communicate with each other even when they were not physically present in the center. So even people in the center that were not consultants began responding to these questions, which the one on there today is, or for that day, was, what would you like the title of your memoir to be? But there was everything ranging from what's your Hogwarts house to what color is your mood today? How are you feeling about midterms? And the board would get fuller and fuller. So it invited people into this space and gave them a way to participate, even if they were hesitant to book a center. You can see in the bottom right-hand corner, we really work to bring ways into the center that acknowledge the place that we live in through posters, painting, the hanging of pareos, plants, all of this which nodded to where we were. And that also was a significant and ongoing effort. And up in the upper right-hand corner, one of our consultants, Tina Togafau, created this wonderful poster as we begin to explore our obligation to acknowledge different people's different identities by recognizing the pronouns they chose to be referred to by. This poster took on a life of its own. It was recognized at the International Writing Center's annual conference, and they asked to display it. So that's actually present in a lot of writing centers across the country right now. So reconceiving place. As notions of reciprocity and privileging and increasingly grounded our work, we increasingly look to Indigenous, specifically Kanaka Maoli concepts and practices to guide our work. We took action to identify ways to support our Kanaka Maoli and Hawaii-based students who traditionally make the least use of the center and make them feel welcome. How we greet, reaching out to different disciplines, especially first-year classes, changing the physical environment of the space. We wanted to recognize the land and the communities in which we live and work and bring them into the center, and bringing the center to them through community outreach. For many, many years, we did weekend outreach with the Boys and Girls Club from the west side. We also did workshops with Kamehameha schools when they organized week-long workshops for students who were not at Kamehameha but had applied, and we participated in those. We also wanted to recognize and support all language diversity, but also foreground Olelo Hawaiʻi in our signage. Consultants conducts in the center. It's not unusual to see consultants conducting sessions in a variety of language, specifically Japanese and Spanish were popular. And then more recently, Olelo Hawaiʻi. We wanted to prominently feature Olelo No'iau in our welcoming, as you saw with the two posters I showed at the beginning. Our goal when I stepped down from the Writing Center director, when I took the associate chair's position, was that all our signage and our website would be in both languages. This is a lot of work, and it's ongoing work. And I'm excited to where it's going to be, but where it's going to head to. The role of research is, I see the role of research as really significant in these endeavors. First of all, sharing insider knowledge and access to the profession is really important. And we did this by collaborating on national and international presentations. A cohort of tutors did an international workshop when I was on a Fulbright in Ireland that was extremely well attended and well received. And so whenever we had opportunity, we presented as a team and a group, because there's no Writing Center director and there's no Writing Center without your consultants. We collaborated on publications, and I also worked to support students who wanted to independently publish. Research legitimizes the work we do in the profession and within our institution. We're an R1 university, publications count. And we also wanted to use our experience to redefine the profession through all of our research. Right now, as I'm sitting on a dissertation that's grounded in our Writing Center. There have been at least 2 master's projects grounded in our Writing Center, and it's very exciting to see this work ongoing. Okay, so the work I describe here only captures those first 7 years, and it was only a beginning. A significant outcome beyond the many successes the consultants have realized is how transformative drawing from Indigenous concepts to inform our practices can be for not only the writers we work with, but also in sustaining a positive and richly productive learning and research environment. But much more work needs to be done. And now I'm going to hand it over to Kalilinoe and Kayla, my current collaborators, who will share how they have furthered the indigenization of the center. Mahalo.
Thank you, Georganne. And we want to say thank you first because you've done so much to give the Writing Center its roots in the university. And part of those roots was preparing Oiwi like us to continue the work. I hope we can continue to learn from you and all of the English department kumu. And I hope we're able to join your va'a and propel us further.
Do you want me to keep on sharing and do the slides?
If you can.
I can.
Thank you. So we wanted to bring in the Olelo No'iau that helped us ground our part of this presentation. And it really recalls the laulima No'iau that Georganne talked about, e lāhui mai nā wa'a, and ours is ho'okahi ka'ilau like ana. And what this No'iau did for us was that it invoked wa'a imagery, and there's this idea of all of us wielding our own tools, mana, and strategies, not just for our select roles, but the strategies and knowledges we're bringing in from outside of our center. And then we're moving forward in the va'a. So there's also this idea of direction and where are we going now that we know what our center is. So yeah, next. So yeah, while discussing how place influenced our practice, we started to look deeply into why we felt like there was some kind of disjunction between what we were taught and then what we we're starting to do already. And we found that the Writing Center is often positioned in a contentious state between the objectives of the Indigenous communities, or as Georganne said, all the communities that our students, the writers, and consultants come from, and the objectives of the colonial institutions. So we found that some of the expectations of the Standard Writing Center included supporting student access, agency, and writing. But what we saw underneath this is that it implies that there are institutional standards, and sometimes this looks like remedial writing. And we know that we're not just doing remedial writing, it's all part of this writing process. So by engaging in this process alone, the center was becoming an accessory to ongoing colonization. So we recognize that sometimes the goals of our writing center fell short and didn't consider place and people as much as it should be. So the goal of the Mānoa Writing Center is definitely the goals of the Standard Writing Center, access, agency, and writing support, but these goals aren't antithetical to the objectives of the lāhui. And we're doing that by recentering sovereignty and decolonization. So we're saying it's not a binary. We just need to find a balance between writing center pedagogy and Kanaka Oiwi praxis and pedagogy. And when we do this, we're able to both support Kanaka Oiwi and the rest of the student body. So recentering encompasses the goals on the basic level and does even more, and we would say by encompassing intellectual and academic well-being. So Kayla's going to take up on some of the pillars of this recentering.
Okay, so on this slide, we sort of covered kuleana and laulima, but these are some of the core guiding epistemologies that are influencing our pedagogies, at least at this point in time. I'll go a bit more into pilina. So to be pili means to stick or cling, adhere, touch, join. And at least to me, pilina implies this, I guess, closely, maybe tightly bound relationship with other beings. Kumuhioli Osorio shares in her book, Remembering Our Intimacies, that our relationships, and this is a quote, teach us that reciprocity and accountability matter, and that intimacy is many-bodied and overflowing. This is the ea of pilina, end quote. So I've sort of been sitting with this quote for a while, and I guess I'm still trying to figure out what that means to me, but it does remind me that our pilina is always interwoven with and inherently connected to acts of aloha aina and our kuleana. So keeping us in line with that reciprocity and also that accountability to those we work with. We as a center are in that process of understanding what those values mean to us. And I think that we're all sort of in various stages of that process, but we are starting to recognize the importance of like building those relationships and sessions. So for example, one of the common practices that we do in our sessions may be leading with asking the client how they're doing or how their day is going. And that is a start to building like that relationship and building rapport in a session and maybe credibility. It also acknowledges, you know, that we're people outside of our sessions and we have our own lives, and that our bodies may also influence how we are writing and interacting with people. And so by engaging with that, we can also judge how to go forth with the session. And then in this process, we're also wanting to recognize our relationship to this aina, as our center is physically located on ceded land, and maybe how we can be accountable to that as well. I think that this is a little blurry now that we are virtual. So we are all also maybe zooming in from various parts of the island and maybe even outside of Hawaiʻi. So that brings in, I guess, more complicated approaches to what this may mean to us and like our positionalities. But I think it also opens up conversations for maybe more place-grounded pedagogies and having those sorts of discussions. And then, as we mentioned earlier, we are starting to transition from these concepts of collaboration to maybe one that is more in line with laulima. So I think Kalilinoe will be talking about that on the next slide.
Thanks, Kayla. And yeah, there's going to be a lot more pillars, but at this time, this is what we identified as our capacity because it's what we're working with right now in our studies, Pilina, laulima, and kuleana. So this is a structure we made when we were first developing how to present this to the other consultants. And this structure was adapted from Georganne's work to help our own minds move between these spaces to more easily train consultants to take up these epistemologies and pedagogy. So we asked ourselves, what are the aho within these bigger pillars that we've identified? So within Writing Center Indigenous pedagogy, we saw collaboration and we followed Georganne's research. And part of recentering collaboration means taking up laulima. So within laulima, we identified other strands that we had to be conscious of. And one of those is mo'oku auhau. And within this context, we saw that mo'oku auhau is the notion of building upon what came before you. So in context, it means knowing that multiple tutors may have come before you, or that a single client is seeing multiple tutors at the same time. So what this looks like practically or in practice is building upon feedback from the many people who've left a mark in this work, including professors, peers, consultants, the writers, their families maybe, and being aware that writing is a product of our intellectual genealogies. So it means we as consultants are respecting those knowledges and having conversations about who works on this writing, as well as encouraging students to see multiple consultants because writing is a collaborative process. It's not a solitary act. So yeah, this I think really emphasizes for the writers and helps them understand that their writing process can be collaborative and it's not just a practice that we're trying to force onto them. So yeah. Before moving to the next one, we don't have a slide on kuleana, but if we were to take collaboration and move it into the realm of kuleana, for example, it would be like dialogic collaboration, where we're voicing the goals of the session and we're determining the power dynamic and power structures. So if we center dialogic collaboration in kuleana, we ask how would this practice be informed by the aho of kuleana? So malama, mo'olelo, mo'oku auhau. So that's one example. And then Kayla's going to pick up on the next slide of how we've started to do this with Pilina.
Yes. So as Georganne sort of brought up earlier, we'd found that place-based pedagogy had tended to overlook this relationship between place and people. So we were shifting towards this aina-based or aina-grounded pedagogy where we're attempting to foreground those relationships, right? And or at least begin growing them. Underlying this transformation is, again, aloha aina, which we call that reciprocity between all beings, and not just humans, but also those who feed, which would include like winds, waters, rain, stones, etc. One of those approaches that we have taken in sessions would be through sharing mo'olelo or talk story. So mo'olelo are, I guess, not only forged through a mo'o or a succession, but are also tied to our mo'oku ahau. And they're also capable of nurturing relationships. As with like aloha or reciprocity, the sharing of stories, even in the form of writing, must be considered through respect. In some sessions, for example, we've had consultants have to like negotiate our kuleana in the sharing of certain stories and knowledge because we're in a certain position where we might hold some power or authority over a client, and they may take our word for things, but we don't necessarily, we want a collaborative process, right, or a cooperation. So we are always trying to be cautious, I guess, when we're trying to share these stories and maybe not lead someone to a certain worldview. Other times, though, we can see how sharing the stories can open up a conversation for the writer and make them feel a bit more comfortable with their writing, or maybe even writing about an experience in their paper. I think Kayla and I wanted to share an example of one of their sessions.
Yes, one example of this slide in action. So we had a client and she was writing a paper on the sense of place. And we know from our grounding that that's basically Vahipana. But as she was doing research and collecting interviews, all she could find were military summaries regarding that time period. But then as we were talking, she felt more comfortable and she started sharing about how she remembered the plantation days, and her emotional tie to that place. And she continued telling that story about what her parents had told her before the plantations, and then after when she revisited that place for this assignment. And because I was a little familiar with some of these pedagogies, I was able to remind her about Kilo. So I encouraged her to continue her chronological telling of this story, but to begin and end with her own story with the land. And when I told her that Kilo was a valid form of Indigenous literacy, she cried, like she was bawling, because for the first time she was able to make sense for the emotions she was feeling for that place and why it was important to include that story in her writing. So she was able to make an argument for Kilo as a form of interview with Aina. So yeah, this was one example of how validating students and their experiences adds to the space and makes it open for their well-being to be at the forefront. Yeah. So besides transitioning these pedagogies within a space that we're comfortable with and we can train the consultants, we also started to look at our mission statement, our wonderful mission statement, which was the product of many great minds. But we thought maybe we can take this a little further. So we sent out a survey, and the general consensus was that it focused almost exclusively on our services, which is fine. But some of us mentioned that we wanted more of a pedagogical grounding, and we wanted that to be weaved in throughout the statement, so that we're not just acknowledging land or where we are, but we're showing that we're walking and talking, doing what we're saying we're doing. So Kayla, do you want to talk about how we're weaving in that pedagogical stance?
Okay, so I think one of the approaches that we're starting to take is rather than having, I think, Georganne, if you could go to the next slide. I think it has our example. So this is what our current mission statement looks like now. And instead of just having that one paragraph sort of encompass our mission statement, we thought to break it up into different sections. So if we can go back to the previous slide, sorry. We were gonna have subsections where we'd cover services, and in that we would interweave these sort of what we talked about with laulima and other kanaka pedagogical approaches. And then we would also wanna acknowledge our mo'oko'ahau as a means of like acknowledging our kuleana and positionality, and also like our kilina, or navigating what that means to us, right? So that would include sort of a history, I suppose, of, we're not quite sure yet on how far we want to go back, but it would be acknowledging the land that we're on and that sort of history as well, and like the ways that we have navigated that as a department and as a writing center. And I think that would also encompass like an intellectual genealogy as well. So maybe who we have learned from and what's informing our pedagogies. And then we would also want to include like current and continuing work that we're doing to keep up the research that Georganne has mentioned, and also to keep us accountable. Kalilinoe, did you want to add on anything to that?
That was pretty much what I was gonna say. Just turning our mission statement into a page of statements like some other writing centers we're doing, so we're following their lead. And then, yeah, like Kayla said, by writing our history section and moving beyond just our history, but also identifying where we're adopting pedagogy. So like where Georganne learned from, where Todd learned from, and then what we're picking up, and then what we're giving on to the next consultants, that just plays a big role. Yeah, so this little diagram at the end, it was inspired by one of my kumu at Kamehameha, where he traced his craft back to the 1700s, and it just invoked a sense of kuleana that, oh, I have to carry this on now, and those are also my kumu. So, yeah.
One more over. Okay, so some other things that we're trying to do in the center is, it's currently in process, but we're crafting a reference sheet that consultants, current and future, may be able to look at. It would include olelo Hawaiʻi, so terms that may come up in sessions, particularly like writing related terms. We'd also want to include diacritical markings in case maybe the consultant doesn't have quick access to the Hawaiian keyboard. And that way they can just have it there, accessibility. And the other thing that we'd want to do is include common placement spellings, because they tend to be not written the way that they're spelled. Uncertain signs are pronounced the way that they should be. So we want to have a place that consultants can look to ensure that we're staying accountable to what we're, preaching, so to speak, not to be biblical. And then some other things that we'd want to do is include it's kind of difficult because we don't want to sort of filter, but have some place where people can look to for Kanaka Wīwī pedagogies as just like an access point or entry point into learning about maybe more Aina-based pedagogies. And then we'd also want to include some Ololo no Eau because they do evoke this sort of epistemological grounding. And that may also give insight to the pedagogies and like these ways of approaching sessions. And then the last thing we would include was suggested readings and links so that we don't get bogged down into this sort of bubble of we can only look here, but also like feel free to explore and read more into what has just been maybe summarized. The other thing that we're currently in the process of doing is creating workshops. These would mostly be sort of trainings for consultants, but they're also a way for consultants to get into learning about these topics. So one of them that is currently in the process of being made by our workshop coordinators, Emily and Kimiko, is like an Olelo Hawaiʻi overview. I think that's covering the diacritical markings, pronunciation, and the piapa. I think so. And then maybe I'm pronouncing wrong, I'm sorry. And then the other thing that we're doing is thinking of doing is like a literary history thing, which would maybe be like pigeon, could be kilo, or maybe covering the newspaper. Those types of things to get us like thinking about, I guess, the various influences that we may have in a writing center, and what we may be promoting with like being a writing center. And then the other thing might be covering specific Indigenous pedagogies. So if someone wants to maybe focus on like Aina or land-based pedagogies, that is a space for them to do so, or maybe just share a reading that they had in class. And the last thing would be sort of the formula that we followed earlier with translating a certain pedagogy that we may be used to, and seeing how it might relate to and bridge a gap between what EV practice. Yeah, those are some of the current works that we have in process. Cool. Anything else?
That's all.
Mahalo.
Mahalo nui. Thank you.
Okay, and mahalo na hoi. I think we can open it up now for if people have questions or comments or invitations to collaboration or whatever way people would like to respond. And I think while we're waiting for that, and any one of you could obviously answer this, but I was just wondering in relation to this being a presentation being done for the Center for Biographical Research, and that so much of Indigenous pedagogies and methodologies are tied to the notion of mo'olelo. The point I always make in relation to Linda Tuhuvei-Smith is if you look at the 24 or so research projects that she says are actually legitimate, about 19 or 20 of them are essentially life writing projects in one way or another in terms of gathering narratives or sharing narratives or whatever. I was just wondering how within all this, because you've done so much about validating the positions of everyone involved in the Palina in relation to those things, could you just talk a little bit about how that notion of life narrative or understanding those kinds of dimensions sort of fit into the overall practice? I mean, how much or how little do you need? How do you determine that in terms of understanding, and how do you tie that into notions of kuleana and also notions of privacy?
I'll start, and then I'm going to turn it over to Kalilinoe and Kayla. I think that Kalilinoe and Kayla and the people that they're working with in the center right now are working towards producing an artifact that better represents the biographical history of our center and its influences. So I'll let them talk about that. But I'm in a very interesting position because I studied under both of the founders of the Writing Center at UH Mānoa. I got to study with Susie Jacobs and Maureen Despain. And Todd Hilgers years ago gave me a handwritten PDF about the Writing Center from 1973 to 1984, or something like that. So I took classes with these people, and they largely influenced my understanding. I began as a 405 course embedded tutor when I first came to UH Mānoa from Kapiolani Community College. And I went on to tutor as a master's student in the Writing Center. And then I became the Writing Center director when I was hired. So in many ways, that biography is embedded right here, and I'm very proud of it. As an aside, because there's some people in this room who know her, I recently reached out to Susie Jacobs because we were going to feature her in one of our newsletters. And when she retired, she moved to, I believe it's North or South Carolina. Why do I know? You'll know, Craig. And she opened up a writing center for Somali female refugees. So this kind of work, it doesn't leave you. It becomes part of your identity. I often think of what I'll do when I retire, and Isaac Wong, another one of the consultants I've worked with very closely, who's now doing his PhD at Purdue on Indigenous writing centers on the continent. And I have talked about opening up a community writing center in Kona. So it's very much embedded in my trajectory of how I've understood this role and adapting towards changes that I want to almost say have been more allowed to happen in the university. But it is time to maybe legitimize that more and acknowledge it more and honor it more by actually writing it down. And I'm going to turn it over to Kalilinoe and Kayla because they have been on me to set up interviews with people who can share the knowledge before I came back in 2012.
So I believe what you're talking about was that Mo'okuau Health section. We wanted to start with the history of the Writing Center. Part of us wanted to go back even further and map not just the physical arrival and creation of the center, but maybe where it ran alongside the English department and English 100, just to rope in our friends, our hoa from the mentoring side. But then also if we could map some of the intellectual genealogies before that, for some of the great Writing Center pedagogy gods. But there's that. But then also in line with what Georganne's saying, I think Kayla can agree, but this was kind of our starting point into Writing Center pedagogy. So understanding that everything we learned from Georganne is part of our biography and how we're conducting ourselves in the Writing Center. So not all of our consultants had the honor of Georganne, some had the honor of Todd, and some are coming from other disciplines. And I think we're aware that the pedagogies we study and practice become a part of their own teaching philosophies that they're going to be carrying outward. So part of this biographical presence is that if we can work on the piko and start from the center, then as we unravel and move outward, we're going to be prepared to clash and grow alongside other pedagogies. I'm not sure if I answered the question, but if Kayla wants to add.
You stated everything perfectly.
Okay, and I will transition over to, in some ways, a historical or biographical point, because we have Aaron Ki'ilau, who's going to ask a question. We're going to unmute, and I think he's had some vague relation to the Writing Center at some point as well, too.
Yeah. First, sorry, I wanted to ask this question face to face. Thank you so much for that presentation. It was a treat. I love working with two of you now. I loved working with Georganne. I don't think I've ever gotten like a fuller history of what happened before me. So this is the first time I was like, wow, that's what it looked like. So thank you for that creation story. Okay, I wrote down 5 questions, but I'm gonna ask one. Which one? So this is a beautiful approach that I really love, and I love, recentering with missions of the lāhui, with Olelo no Eao. I always look to those as well. But are there moments, and this is because I love stories about interactions between clients, because we can talk all day about what we want to do for clients, but specific interactions. Are there moments when this approach either confuses or disagrees with clients that come in, especially when they come to the Writing Center with certain, those expectations of standardizations or the colonial ones? If so, how is that handled? Does that help? And do they come back? And if they do come back, why? And what does that look like?
Since we're taking a biographical approach here, I'll start because I think some of my experiences predate the current iterations of consulting that's been going on, especially since the pandemic. Yes, Aaron, yes. Basically, yes. Especially, I'm a huge advocate of linguistic social justice and language diversity. Some of my recent published work focuses on moving away from academic discourse and making room for other kinds of discursive conventions, not only in publication, but in all of our communications, so that communities have more access to our work. So that's always been a big issue. And we've had numerous conversations on what does it mean to support students' linguistic diversity, but then have implicit in Writing Center work this almost need to acquiesce to academic discursive conventions because students need a certain grade in their courses. From what I know from my role as the Vice President of the International Writing Center Association, this is not unique to our center. This is something that we're grappling not only in writing centers, but in composition pedagogy in general, because as we advocate for people to use their voices, there are words that don't translate into academic discourse. And we all know that academic discourse is a language you learn. Very few people grew up speaking and writing like that. So how can we blend and meet the needs of all this, as well as the, the intellectual value I particularly place on linguistic social justice, and yet not inhibit what some students want. They want they want to succeed in their classes, and not every professor that they may interact with feels the same way. So yes, it has always been an issue. One of the classic Writing Center prompts you say, if someone what you're reading on the paper is not actually making sense, is tell me how you would say it. And then the next one is write it like that. And then let's go from there. My question has always been, why do we got to go from there if I understood it? Especially when you're working with second language speakers who sometimes have the most beautiful phrasing of a sentiment or an experience, but it's not actually what we would write if we were writing for an academic discursive project. And it's almost painful to ask them to edit it because it loses so much of the nuance and the beauty of those phrases. But I haven't sat in a tutoring chair in a long time, so I'm going to turn it over to people who actively work with writers.
Thank you, Erin, for the question. I feel very fortunate that I've never really had a client who is actively disagreeing or confrontational in a session. I've had a few clients who have come in a bit resistant because they do have those expectations of, I want this to be done, but what I may be trying to approach the session from may not be, meeting those expectations. But I suppose what I found though is having those, or bringing in Mo'olelo and starting to talk, starting a session, maybe asking, okay, but why did you approach this topic? Finding out that relationship that they might have, that kuleana with that topic has actually opened up more conversation and made, I guess, that resistance crumble a little, if I can say it like that. And I think that in going about that session that way, it helps also to build a relationship between us. And yeah, I don't know. I've had quite a few returning clients, And even when we've had maybe that disagreement in the very beginning, I've not necessarily seen clients be like, I'm never coming back to you. You know, they would always be open to exploring at least maybe other consultants and seeing maybe the various ways that people tutor and what works for them, right?
And just to add on, I feel like some of the clients that I've had where they're confused or we had a disagreement in the beginning, usually I would return to dialogic collaboration and take a more directive approach. And I think taking that directive stance, it clarifies our kuleana within this interaction. And then they'll become more aware of what I'm aware of, my knowledge is, and then they have a better understanding of what to expect from me. At least doing that, I guess, it makes them less worried about what to expect. Yeah, but then there's also some clients who they're coming from a different cultural background, and just elaborating more on like mo'olelo and some of our epistemologies, we're able to draw connections because things like aloha aina, it's prevalent in so many other cultures too. It's not just a Hawaiian thing. So being able to hear some of the ways that aloha aina has moved with us and we've moved with aloha aina, they were able to make connections within their own culture. So just communication has usually been a great starting point.
You know, I know we're I think we're almost out of time, but I wanted to close with, this was your question, Aaron, is big for me. I actually did a comparative study when I was in Ireland with the Writing Center consultants at the National University of Ireland in Galway, and the same study with our consultants. And the results were so fascinatingly similar about tutors really not wanting to intervene with the way a writer expresses themselves, but feeling a conflict about an obligation because they didn't want to inhibit their success in a class. So I take the stance that those of us with more cultural capital in the academy have to initiate those moves. It shouldn't be on our consultants because that is our kuleana. I can tell you at the International Writing Center Association, we're committed to having our flagship journal publish things in other languages than English going forward.
Thank you. Beautiful responses. You're doing beautiful work. Mahalo.
Okay, and in the interest of continuing to go forward, I'm afraid I'm going to have to also bring it to an end because other people are going to need to go forward to other responsibilities. There's another talk later today on life writing in the English department, and I know I have to teach a class this evening, and so we always try and make sure that we end on time. But I'd like everyone to join me in thanking our presenters today who have provided a really diverse and balanced and useful way of thinking about writing centers and their relation to telling and receiving lives. So, mahalo.